zone that you're in. Thank you so much for taking the time out a week before Passover. I know how busy the time is. I know I'm very busy. And I appreciate the responsibility of having to give this webinar. It gives me a good excuse to be able to lock myself in my office and learn some Torah that I want to share with you. Also, I want to thank Evan Silbert for the technical support, and Jeff, of course, for everything that he does behind the scenes. So if you look at the first slide, let's just run through the questions that we're not going to tackle them one by one. How can ritual enhance your Mussar practice and develop character? How can you elevate your mitzvot so that they have the intended effect upon your soul? And finally, why did the Mussar masters emphasize ritual as a form of Mussar practice? Again, we're not going to go through these questions one by one, but I hope that through the course of the next hour, 45 minutes to an hour, we will have a pathway to understanding some of these points, or all of these points, I hope. Passover, interestingly, is the most widely celebrated holiday among Jews. I saw recently that something like 80% of American Jews have some form of celebration. And we know that the holiday is very much focused on tradition and ritual. And I wonder if that's connected. I wonder if the importance of ritual in our tradition and how the rituals themselves seem to foster a connection to that tradition. I know my own memories growing up of my Pesach Seder, we always used to do it with my father's parents. We're both not alive anymore. My grandfather was the Archie Bunker type, if you're familiar with that 70s television program. You know, he didn't have the easy chair, and the best thing you can get out of him was not half bad. You know, there was never too many wonderful or compliments, and he was a very interesting guy. And one of the memory that comes back in my mind when I think about those young years, you know, when I was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, my grandfather would always take for the murrah, for the bitter herbs, he would always use the root of the horseradish, which is a very bitter vegetable, and we would use the lettuce or other things, and we would grind it up so it wasn't as powerful. He would take a big bite out of it and chew it until he was beet red in the face. And, this is what we're going to really focus on tonight, how these rituals enhance our traditional practice and what that means for us. There's a very famous quote that was originally said by George Santayana and revised slightly by Winston Churchill that said, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." I would say in the Jewish tradition, and certainly specifically on the night of Passover, we are told that we must experience our past in the present so that we may continue to be a link in the long chain of tradition into the future. My next slide, two very important quotes. Both come from the Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah, although one really originates in the Mishnah. The first one says, and I hope everybody can see my slides, B'chol dor v'dor, I'll read it first in Hebrew and then I'll translate, B'chol dor v'dor chayev adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, which is really a Mishnah. And the Mishnah tells us in every generation a person must see oneself as though he or she had gone out of Mitzrayim. That is our responsibility. Our responsibility is to see ourselves as if we are going out of Mitzrayim. The second quote that I want to call your attention, and this is really the theme of everything we're going to discuss this evening here in Israel. Mitzvah aleinu, the second one, Mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim. V'chol hamar b'lesaper b'yetzias Mitzrayim arei v'meshubah. Which translates, it is a mitzvah for us to tell the story of our redemption from Egypt. And the more one tells the story of our redemption from Egypt, it is praiseworthy. So we have here these two quotes. Number one, we have to see ourselves as if we ourselves are going out of Mitzrayim. And number two, it's a mitzvah to tell the story of the redemption, and the more you tell, the more praiseworthy it is. Here's a very interesting Mussar quote, which is attributed to the Alter of Kelm. I saw it both from Rabbi Rucham Levovitz in the name of the Alter of Kelm, and I also saw it in the name of the Lev Eliyahu Lopian, two of the great Bali Mussar from about 100 years ago, 85 years ago. And they said an interesting comment on the second quote. The second quote says that, like I translated it, it's a mitzvah. The more one tells the story, the more praiseworthy that is. In other words, telling the story, the more you tell, the more detail you go into, the more praiseworthy. But he said differently. He said that it goes on the person also. That means that the more that you tell the story, the more that you relive the story, the more praiseworthy you will be. The more elevated you will become. And that's really the whole idea of both the Pesach Seder and of our discussion this evening. Very interesting comment. Right? Taking it out of its simple reading, that it's praiseworthy to do it, but more than that, it will make you more praiseworthy. You will become more elevated in the process. The first point I want to discuss, and we'll have about maybe a half general Mussar approach to experience, practice, and ritual, and then we'll discuss some of the specific rituals of the Passover experience. So the first thing I wanted to touch upon is Mussar's focus on experience and action. There's a quotation that I like to use to put things in perspective from Yisroel Salanter, the modern-day father of the Mussar movement, and he expressed it this way. He said, through Mussar, what we try to do is we bring together the eye that thinks and identifies with things with the eye that feels and is sensitive and aroused by things. What he means is to acquire knowledge, not just to know something intellectually, but to acquire knowledge and thereby change as a human being. It's not enough to learn something in an intellectual way, but that has to be combined with an experience of the idea. When the two things come together, the eye that thinks and the eye that feels and experiences, then you have true knowledge. Then you have the type of knowledge which can effect change. We're all familiar with the term experiential knowledge. And we all know that, it's impossible to describe the color of an apple to a blind person. But that really relates also to the value that the Mussar masters place on action. It's a very painful realization, maybe that when you get older, I think it's less painful, because we become more realistic with age, that we're not philosophers. We like to think when we're in our 20s and when you're a teenager, you like to think maybe that you're a real philosopher. The truth of the matter is that we're really not philosophers. I once had this discussion with many students over the years. I once had a student of mine said that he's a philosopher. I have this all the time. He's a philosopher, but he smokes cigarettes. And I said to him that, how do you put those two things together? It's clearly you know that your smoking is dangerous to you. It's not healthy. Yet, you call yourself a philosopher. A philosopher means that in the world of ideas, that relates naturally, or that affects your life. You live your life according to the things that you think, your values, and that's not true. And that's itself the problem with philosophy. If we go a little bit deeper, and I'll give you an example. If you study humility, just as an example, imagine that you want to study the trait, the soul trait, the midah of humility, anava. And you lay down on your couch or your love seat or your recliner, and you meditate very deeply while you're relaxing on your sofa about the midah of humility. It's very difficult to access that midah when you're in that position. It just is. A better way to do it would be to think deeply about it and then to put yourself in a posture which allows the message to penetrate. The depth is that God decided that the physical reality is real. The Jewish sources tell us that in order to make free will possible, He created a physical world which in some way conceals His presence, conceals the spiritual as being the essence of true reality, which it is. But because of that, in order for something to be real, it has to find expression in some way, or I didn't say it has to, but the more it finds expression in the physical, the more real we experience it. The Talmud tells us that even Torah study, the most intellectual of all mitzvot, a person should always say the words out loud when they study Torah. Why is that? Same idea. Because the more you bring your thoughts into the realm of the physical, into the realm of the hearing, the sensory world, the more it affects you. Let's take a look now at a couple of basic, foundational quotes from the masters of Mussar, going back earlier even in the Shofar. We'll start with a sefer that's about 1,000 years old called the Sefer Achinuch. It's an unknown author, and he says in the first quote, hope everybody can see the slides again. Take a look at the first quote. Know that a person is influenced according to his actions. In Hebrew, Adam nifal lefi pu'ulotav, or pu'ulotav. One's heart and all one's thoughts are always drawn after the deed in which he is occupied for good or for bad. As a matter of fact, two amazing things about this quote. Number one, this is the theme of his entire book. He keeps on coming back to this idea. It's in the 16th mitzvah. He wrote on all 613 mitzvot, but this is the theme. He mentions it in his introduction, and this is the theme that he goes back to throughout all of the 613 mitzvot. He doesn't mention in every one, but this is his theme. His theme is that one's heart and all one's thoughts are always drawn after the deed in which he's occupied, for good and for bad. It's interesting also that mitzvah 16 concerns the night of Passover, because the mitzvah 16 is the mitzvah that one is not allowed when eating the korban Pesach. We don't have this mitzvah today. When you eat the sacrifice that was brought in the times of the temple, called the Passover sacrifice, there's a negative commandment that one is not allowed to break the bones. One is not allowed to break the bones while eating. We'll see later on tonight what some of the depth of that mitzvah is. But on that mitzvah is where he says this comment. The second quotation I have over here is from Rabbi Mussar Lens. And listen to what he said. A shining light. Mussar, he's talking over here in the third letter in his book, Or Yisrael, which is a collection of his letters. Rabbi Mussar Lens. This quotation is he's describing what is the point of Mussar. What is the entire point of Mussar? And he says that the entire point of Mussar is to be a shining light by which the external limbs will move, that they should fight with valor for the sake of truth and righteousness. For this is the fruit of all of our labors, to guard the external limbs, my emphasis, from any evil affliction and disease. Again, a clear focus on the external. The author of Talmud, we just mentioned, one of the great students of Rabbi Avi, once said that we find that doctors, physicians in his time, were often cruel, or not cruel is too strong a word, but they were like achzari. They were very tough. They were tough. And he said that the reason is because in those days they didn't have anesthetic, and a lot of times what they had to do was something very cruel. They had to cut people's limbs off, and that affected them. You always, imagine the executioner with a black hood on his head. The executioner with the black hood, how do you think that person would be after 10 years of his job? It affects us. A third quote, this comes from the Path of the Just. And this is also very important from a Mussar perspective. The one in whom this desire for divine service does not burn as it should would do well to stir himself by force of will, so that, as a result, this desire will become natural. Why? For outer movements awaken inner desire. Over here, the Ramchal is talking about the midah of alacrity, zirizut, enthusiasm, and he's saying that sometimes we don't feel enthusiastic. It's hard for us to get going. One of the best ways to get yourself going is to just get your body moving. Right? We all know how debilitating laying in bed is for somebody who's depressed, or somebody who is feeling low. The worst thing that a person can do when you're feeling low is to be inactive. Activity creates enthusiasm. So now let's discuss how. How does this all work? In other words, how do we get the most out of our actions? How do we get our limbs, in the words of Rabbi Salanter, the poetic words of Rabbi Salanter, how could we have our limbs fight with valor for the sake of truth and righteousness? So, the first point is that even though we're focusing here on outward action, it's essential that the thought and the action be connected. Actions without thought are not what we're talking about. Actions without thought fail in the process of actualization of potential. To actualize potential, you need a circuit. You need the potential to find an actualization of that potential. The same is true with the process of our actions being an effective way to learn, to experience, and ultimately to change. So therefore, what one must do is to think deeply, philosophically even, about a midah, about something righteous, and then actualize that potential, because as a thought it's just potential, actualize it in an action. The realization of potential is when the circuit is complete, is when you have thought relating to action. It sounds so simple, yet the power of the effect of actualizing potential in that way is enormous. The second thing relating as well to the thing I just mentioned is that you have to be fully aware and present in your actions. It's not enough just to think. It's not enough just to act. You have to follow through in your act with presence of mind, fully aware and present in your actions. Those of you who have worked on any of the midot in a practical way found this to be a challenge. In other words, you work on the midah of generosity and you accept upon yourself to do 1 or 2 or 3 acts of generosity a day. And they can become perfunctory actions without being fully present. It's so hard to be fully present in our actions, but that's what's required if our actions are going to have the power that they are meant to have. There's something I always like to quote, the holy Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim lived about 100 years ago. He was considered the world over the greatest rabbi of his generation. He was famous for making lashon hara, evil speech, slander, gossip, into bringing it out from the mitzvot that were somehow forgotten to the forefront of the Jewish mind. So he used to say, what was the blessing that he used to give a 13-year-old boy or a 12-year-old girl when they became men or women in the Jewish sense? They are now full members of Klal Yisrael, of the community of Israel. They are now required to do mitzvot, just like every adult. So he used to say, I have one small bit of advice for you. It's a very small and simple thing. Before you do a mitzvah, before you do an action, think. Think for 1 second before you do your action. If you think 1 second, 1 moment, if you take that time, that pause to think before you act, that will elevate, that will bring the power, all the power to your actions. So we have the circuit, the importance of the external, because that's what's real in quotation marks, but it must connect back to thought and being present and aware in our actions. The second piece is, when we talk about, and this goes a little bit deeper, and I hope you will be able to appreciate this, but again, I'm sure I'm speaking over here to people that have actively practiced Mussar. So when we take a Kabbalah, an active practice that we do, we pick any midah, generosity that we mentioned, that we're going to do 3 deeds of 3 generous acts a day. So what that's about from a Mussar perspective is that, as we've seen, as we've already learned, experience is the most effective way to learn. And we'll discuss that more as we go. But there's a couple of other important points. Number 1, actions, and sometimes rituals, require that we stretch ourselves. And we know how important stretching ourselves can be when it comes to change. The example that I always like to get, I'm a bit of a gym rat. I'm pretty good about going to the gym a couple times a week for the last 20 years. And we all know that if you want to build muscle, which I don't want to anymore, but I just do it for exercise, but certainly if you want to build muscle, you have to stretch yourself. You have to you have to go that extra mile. You have to put the extra weight on the bar till it becomes really difficult. Because that's how you change. You have to move out of your comfort zone. There's another aspect to active practice, and that is the following quote from the Rambam. The Rambam tells us on his Pirush, his commentary to Pirkei Avot, he tells us like this: true growth, look at the slide, true growth is not attained through the magnitude of one's actions, rather through numerous repetitive actions. Growth is attained through repeating proper actions many times. Through this, a strong acquisition is made. Not by doing one great action of good, not by doing one great action of good. For example, one who gives 1,000 pieces of gold to one deserving recipient and to others gives nothing will not, through this one great action, attain the trait of generosity. However, one who in the spirit of charity gives one piece of gold to 1,000 deserving people will attain this trait. And this is, again, a very important concept in Mussar practice. We look for repetition, we look for consistency through these processes, that is, stretching ourselves, through being fully present in our actions, and finally, repetition. Those are the ways that our active Mussar practice has the power to change us. Finally, and this is the deepest of all the concepts, it's important to be self-aware while you act. And this we'll come back to again later, which means like this. The way I always like to look at it is you need to have two eyes. You need to have an eye focused on what it is you are doing, and at the very same time, you have to have another eye looking and observing yourself in the action. Because again, we know, just to take the example through generosity, we know that we all want to be generous, and we all think in some level that we're generous, and we can learn about generosity and the importance of generosity, and we can be, yes, I want to be generous, I feel generous right now. But then when it comes to the act of generosity, sometimes there are all kinds of things that burble up. All kinds of, is this person really worthy? My time could be spent doing other things. And all those negative traits sort of burble to the surface when we act upon our generosity. But that's such an important aspect of the physical actions. That is, that it gives us a tremendous amount of self-awareness and self-knowledge. Going further, now let's take a look at specifically ritual when it comes to Mussar practice. And I'm going to tell you a quote now, and I'll give you a second to think. Who said this? Somebody who's alive today. He said, ritual can play a powerful role in inspiring ethical living. Anybody know who said that? Ritual can play a powerful role in inspiring ethical living. That was actually said by Rick Jacobs, the president of the URJ, the United Reformed Synagogue, in his inaugural speech that he gave in Park Slope in Brooklyn, New York. I actually was there, not at that speech, but in the synagogue. And that's Rick Jacobs. Rick Jacobs said that ritual can play a powerful role in inspiring ethical living. Certainly in the traditional Mussar, or the traditional Mussar tradition, if you will, you have to go back to understand this point. First of all, the context in which the traditional Baalei Mussar, the masters of Mussar, were speaking was within a tradition of ritual. That means that the context and the people to whom they were generally teaching, it was a davar pashut, you say in Hebrew. It was self-evident that they were practicing ritual. And therefore, much of what they said was in that context. The way they looked at what they were teaching, what they were innovating, was more of like the science of engineering, which is not to replace ritual, but how to make my ritual more meaningful. That was what they were trying to do. A second point that to me is close to my heart is that if one rejects ritual, and we'll talk about mitzvot in a second, that specific word, mitzvot. But if one rejects rituals as a form of Mussar practice, I believe that's very arrogant. I believe there's a certain arrogance to that. Because it requires the humility of appreciating what the tradition has to say before rejecting, out of hand, that rituals are not for me. Because there's a certain lack of authenticity if a person is willing to say, well, I like Mussar, I like what the Mussar teachers have to say, I like Mitzvot, but when it comes to rituals, I don't have any. I can't have any connection to that. Now, I'm not suggesting that one cannot work without the other. I believe it can. But again, there's a certain lack of humility in out of hand rejecting the power of ritual. When we talk about mitzvot, and the literal translation of mitzvot is a commandment, to put it in the proper context, it's not something in the Mussar tradition which is nice but not necessary. It's actually something that's a demand, a requirement. Again, returning to the gym, if you want to put weight if you want to grow, if you want to build muscle, you have to put the weight on the bar. It seems to me, in my humble opinion, that if something is just nice but not necessary, it lacks a lot of that weight, a lot of that resistance that will build muscle and build a real self and real change. And it's only when we're up against demands, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, that you have this inner tension that moves you in the direction of change. Finally, I hope I didn't, nobody's signing off now. All right, this guy's crazy. I hope you know me well enough that these are things that I struggle with just as much as you do. I mean that fully. Rituals are difficult. They become habitual and they become meaningless. And there's a tremendous danger in that. And there are things that we don't understand and they're hard to get into. I agree with all that and I experience all that. But it takes a certain amount of humility and a certain amount of self-awareness to appreciate that this tension is a healthy thing. The final point I want to mention about ritual, before we go to speak about some of the specific rituals of Passover, is that it tends to break us from our natural slumber. There's a certain invigoration, bringing things to life. Again, I go back to my experience growing up. Some of those rituals that I saw in front of my eyes, they're there forever. And so much of our lives, we live in this sort of slumber, busy doing everything except for spiritual practice because life has so many demands. This week I not only have to deal with preparing for Passover, but I'm trying to buy a used car for my wife. Now, buying a used car, if anybody has ever done that, is probably one of the worst things you could ever do. Buying a used car the week before Passover compounds it, and doing it in Israel, that just throws a monkey wrench in it. So it's been a very busy and, besides work and besides all my other responsibilities, everybody has responsibilities. There's a beautiful message that I heard from Chaim Saffron, one of the people that has come to teach for us at the Mussar Institute. So he had a beautiful message. It says in the Torah, it says that Paro, when he subjugated the Jewish nation, he gave them what was called avodas parah. Avodas parah means back-breaking labor with really no purpose. He had them doing things that, just to keep them busy. And Chaim brings out the point from the Balei HaMussar, from the Mussar masters, that that's what happens in our lives. What happens in our lives is that we're just, so involved with our daily rituals, and I don't mean spiritual rituals, our daily demands, our daily, work, and the kids, and your parents, and your relationships, and there's so much to do all the time that we don't have time to reflect. We don't have time to appreciate what's really important. And rituals have had that effect on us. Rituals pull us away from all that and focus us back to the spiritual. So now, I'll take, we have about 25 minutes left, a little less than that. Do you mind terribly if I continue? Is there something very pressing that somebody wants to ask at this point? My camera's a little bit. Is that better? Okay, we'll continue. Camera's good now, right? Everybody sees me? Okay. So let's take a look at some of the Pesach rituals. We start by the search for chametz. The search for chametz, cleaning the house, looking for the bread and the crumbs, and if you have little children like me, it's a very labor-intensive process. People get all excited about it, nervous about it, but the Talmud tells us that we're not just supposed to be looking for our chametz, but the Talmud tells us that chametz is representative of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination which is in all of us. The way they understand that is that the central Yetzer Hara within us is arrogance, is puffiness. Chametz comes from the process of putting water together with flour and yeast and letting it sit. Through time, it becomes puffy. So what the Balei HaMussar teach us is that when you are searching for your chametz, when you're searching your house to get rid of all the bread and the crumbs and the beer of your chametz, what you're really supposed to be doing is putting a shining light to your Yetzer Hara. You're supposed to be looking also in the act into yourself and removing all vestiges of that arrogance that's within you. And of course, the midah of vizut, of alacrity, which is central to this whole time that we're in, pre-Pesach, Passover itself, because again, the whole process of chametz is simply what happens when you put water, flour, and yeast together, you let it sit for more than 18 minutes, the rabbis tell us, it becomes chametz. Matzah is simply baked before 18 minutes. There's other things that means you can't add sugar, you can't add other ingredients, bare bones, just water and flour, but it doesn't sit, it doesn't wait around, it goes. There's an amazing story that I like to tell over. I'll tell it as quickly as possible. This is a Hasidic story. You'll beg my pardon here if I leave Mussar for a second and throw in one Hasidic story. The story goes of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak from Berdichev, who lived about 150 years ago in a town called Berdichev in Russia. And he was about to make Kiddush on the night of the Leila Seder, and the Seder was about to make Kiddush, and he said to his Hasidim, he said, I can't make Kiddush until you bring me 20 silk scarves, a pound of tobacco, and a loaf of bread. Now, apparently, the government had outlawed these silk scarves and tobacco. These things were contraband, and if you were caught with them, it was a terribly large fine or you were in prison. So, of course, the English Hasidim, they didn't ask questions. They went to look. And they came back an hour later and they said, Rebbe, we only found 2 scarves. It's very hard. And of course, where are we going to find bread on the night of Passover in Berdichev? It's impossible. We can't find. None of the Jews have any bread. He said, well, I'm not going to start my Seder until you bring me those things. So you better get going. So off the Hasidim went, and they worked even harder than the first time. And they came back an hour later, and they had 100 scarves, and they had 5 pounds of tobacco, but they still didn't have any bread. And they said to the Rebbe, Rebbe, we looked and we looked and we looked, and we couldn't find any bread. And if Levi Yitzchak turned his eyes heavenward and he said, Ribono Shel Olam, the master of the world, look at your Jewish people. They're willing to risk having scarves that are punishable by 25 years in prison and tobacco. But look how they treat your laws. There's nobody in the entire town of Raditziv that has any bread. That's the story. I think it's a very nice story to appreciate how the tradition and the rituals of tradition have been really something that people took seriously, and people till today take very seriously. Take a look at the next slide. The next slide says like this. It's really a Mishnah, but it's quoted in the Haggadah. Rabbi Gamliel used to say, whoever does not mention these three things on Passover does not fulfill their obligation. These are they: Pesach, the Passover offering, matzah, and maror, the bitter herbs. The Passover offering is offered because the omnipresent or omniscient one passed over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt. Matzah is eaten because our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt. The bitter herb is eaten because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors in Egypt. So let's go through these three mitzvot, these three rituals. Although we don't have the Passover offering today, we'll learn a little bit about it. And we, of course, have a zesher, a remembrance, on the Seder plate. The custom is to have a piece of meat or a neck of a chicken is, I think, the custom that I grew up with. That's what we do in our house. Of having that neck on the Seder plate to represent the Passover offering. The Passover offering, the rabbis tell us, is, well, what does the word Pesach mean? So everybody translates the word Pesach as Passover, and that represents that God passed over the houses of the Jews to the Egyptians, and he killed the firstborn of the Egyptians. There's actually the Targum, which is the most authentic, so to speak, translator of the Bible. He translates the word Pesach to mean compassion. How those two things go together? So the rabbis tell us, and the Bali Mussar bring this out as well, that the idea of the Pesach offering was a representation of the unique relationship, the sacred relationship that God showed and has with the Jewish nation. That's the idea of he passed over. I mean, all the other plagues didn't affect the Jews either. So what's the emphasis over here that he passed over? Again, the emphasis is that he passed over means he had a sacred relationship with the Jewish nation. And that's really holiness. Holiness is a sacred relationship. Sacred means special. There's a lot of laws, we won't go through all of them, just mentioning how the physical representation of the Pesach offering represent this unique or sacred one relationship that we have with God. Just to run through a few of them, the Pesach offering was a 1-year-old lamb. It had to be 1 year old, oneness. A lamb is apparently a very sensitive animal, right? That the sensitivity shows again his oneness. The offering had to be roasted whole. It couldn't be cut up into pieces. It had to be roasted whole. Oneness. It had to be roasted and not cooked. What's the idea of roasting versus cooking? Roasting, when you roast something, it becomes smaller, more contracted. Again, the idea of oneness. The Pesach offering had to be eaten together as a group. It couldn't be eaten individual. It had to be eaten together as a group. And finally, something we mentioned earlier, it was not permissible to break any of the bones of the Pesach offering when eating it. Again, all of this comes to represent the oneness. And as you have the Seder plate in front of you, and you pick up the Pesach offering, that's the idea that you're trying to tell over and experience on some level, the unique, special relationship that the Jewish nation has with God. Let's take a look at the next mitzvah. The next mitzvah called matzah. Everybody's familiar with the matzah. The matzah is very unique. It's very interesting because on the one hand it's called poor man's bread, and on the other hand it's supposed to symbolize our freedom, our redemption. As we saw take a look at the slide, matzah is eaten because our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt. Now that's strange. How does poor man's bread, how does that relate to redemption or freedom? And the idea is beautiful. The idea is really beautiful. Just yesterday, my 13-year-old son asked me, he said, Abba, how come if we have come so far technologically in the past 100 years, and there are so many things that we can do today quickly that they couldn't do 100 years ago, how come we don't have much more time on our hands? Isn't that a beautiful question? And the answer is the matzah. The answer is simplicity. Because what is matzah? Matzah is just water and flour. Nothing else. And that's freedom. I always have the image, when I go to the beach and you see this guy or this girl. I try to go to beaches without women, but when you see this guy jogging along, with the long hair, and there's a part of you that says, "Wow, I wish I could be him." He's so free. Right? No obligations, probably doesn't have a job, And of course that's wrong, and I don't mean, I'm just bringing out a point. But isn't that true? That the more tied we are to this and to that, to our possessions, right? The more possessions we have, doesn't seem to give us more freedom. The more technologically advanced we are, it doesn't seem to give us more time. It just complicates life. That's the beauty. So the poor man's bread, the Maharal Prague tells us, the poor man's bread represents freedom because it represents simplicity. That's the reason it has no taste. Because even taste sort of, it tells you, think this way or experience this and not that. Now, the Pesach, the matzah is tasteless. It's tasteless because it's totally free. There's an idea that goes a little bit further in the matzah, and that is that when we talk about freedom in matzah, we're not talking about freedom from obligation, but we're talking about serving God. So that comes full circle. So that the freedom that we're talking about is not when you throw off every constraint or restraint, every obligation in your life, but it's about an effective structure, a direction, and the boundaries that you place in order to live your life in ways that liberate from negative possibilities and move you along the pathway to spiritual wholeness. That's what the matzah represents. So again, when you take the matzah and you think these ideas, simplicity, serving God, not serving everybody else, and then you eat it, that's an experience, that's a ritual that really can be a powerful experience. Finally, the mower, the bitter herbs, again, reminding myself of my Zaidi, my grandfather. The mower is a very complex thing. It's bitter. And we are supposed to experience, as we began to see this evening, we're supposed to experience the bitterness of exile, of slavery. And that's what the mower comes to say. But in biblical times, and in the times of the temple, you had to eat the Pesach offering, which represents the oneness of God, together with the matzah, which represents freedom, and the maror. We do a remembrance to this in the Haggadah when we take the matzah and we put the maror together. And the reason we don't put any of the Pesach offering is because we don't want to make it seem like we're really offering the Pesach. We don't have that offering today, but we put the two together and we eat them together. What does that represent? That represents for us that philosophically we know that the good and the bad come from God. It's easy, or it's easier sometimes to attribute the good things in our lives, the positive things that happen, the blessings in our lives to God, and it's much more of a challenge for the negative things that happen. And we all experience that pain, we all experience loss, we all experience trials and tribulations. It's important for us to acknowledge that comes from God as well. The second idea is that there's a double-edged sword about being a Jew. And our tradition is replete with disasters, torturers. The Jewish nation has been thrown out of literally every country in the world. And that's a double-edged sword that we should brandish with honor. That a father only punishes the son or the daughter. It represents part of the loving relationship that we have with our Master in heaven that we suffer. And it's not fun, and it's not pleasant, but a good father can't always be pleasant. And that's part of what we're supposed to remember and pass on to our children, and sometimes pass on to ourselves. Anti-Semitism is not an easy thing. It's an illogical thing. It's something that we have no way of really fully appreciating and understanding. At the same time, we're still here. The Jewish nation lives on, and it's a part of our tradition. It's a necessary part of our tradition, and it's a necessary part of that which we experience to go out of Mitzrayim from the good to the bad, from the bad to the good, and it's an important part of our tradition. Finally, the last point I want to mention about the Leila Seder, the night of the Passover Seder, is the focus on taste and enjoyment. Because what is it that the Seder, the night of the Seder is all about? It's about passing on our tradition. It's about being the link in that long chain of tradition. It's about showing our children that it's sweet, our tradition. That it tastes delicious. There's a midrash that tells us that when Isaac was going to bless his sons, and he tells them, what does he do before? He tells them, before I bless you, please go out and get me matamim, those delicacies. Why? Why is it important before he bestows his blessing that he has to eat a good meal? So the Midrash tells us that was the night of Leil HaPesach, the night of the greatest blessings and the blessings that come out throughout Jewish history on the night of Passover. Right? The Midrash tells us that was the night of Passover. In order to pass on blessing, it has to taste good. It has to start from you. You have to really feel that it's delicious, that it tastes good. In Yiddish, it's geschmack, which means that it's impossible to give over to your children the feeling, the grandeur of our tradition if it's something that is not sweet and delicious to you. And that's why it's important to have a delicious meal. That's why it's important to play games and to have fun at your Seder. And my Seder, for many years, as I get older, becomes more of a challenge. We used to have, we would do all kinds of games. Me and my wife, in our younger years, would actually act out different scenes for our children. And now that they're older, we have now older children, so now they act out plays. They actually perform plays for us. And we try to make it as sweet and as enjoyable as possible. For years, I actually was looking for it, but I couldn't find it this year. But I have a cardboard box that I put gold paper on, and I made a little hole, and inside I put a bunch of little tickets, so to speak, little crumbled up pieces of paper, and inside the papers are different prizes. And if the kid asks a good question, or he says a good answer, or he's just involved, he sings a song, he's allowed to stick his hand into the box, pull out so each of the tickets said something like, you get 3 shekels, $3 if you're in America, or you get a kiss from Abba, which is obviously one of the prizes that they didn't like too much. Or all kinds of different prizes. You get a small toy. In the early years, I used to put my wife used to scream at me that the prizes were too big. So as the years went on, the prizes got smaller. But the idea is to encourage involvement, and the tradition has to be sweet. There was when I was dating, and I'm running out of time, but we're almost done. When I was dating, I took a girl to an off-Broadway play, which was I forgot what it was called, but it was basically a Jewish girl has to come home to her parents for the Pesach Seder. It was a comedy. And she winds up, she didn't have a date, and of course she can't come home to mom and dad without a date, without somebody that you're dating, because it doesn't look nice, and your parents are going to get on you about getting married when you're getting married. So she hires somebody to come with her, and she tries to pick the most Jewish name she can out of the people on the list to take, and as an escort, and she takes this really Jewish-sounding name. It turns out, of course, the guy is not Jewish. And the whole play goes through, he comes to the Pesach Seder, and she's sure that he, of course, has experienced this with his parents, and he has no idea what's going on. And you can imagine how crazy going to a Pesach Seder for the first time might be. We have a cup of wine and then no meal for like an hour. Like, what's going on? The table's set and there's no meal, right? We take a piece of potato or celery and dip it in salt water. Like, what is going on? All kinds of crazy things that we do, and the whole point is to stimulate questions, because to pass on the tradition, you have to pique the interest of your children. It has to be exciting and fun, and it has to be a dialogue. It has to be invoking questions, and that again is one of the major themes of the Pesach Seder, and one of the beauties of our rituals. The beauty of our ritual here in the night of Passover is how it's designed for us not only to experience with our own bodies as much as possible the feeling of moving from slavery to the exuberance of redemption, but it's also a way in which we pass on the beauty of our tradition to the next generation. I'll finish with one more quote. Rabbi Levovitz said that. Now that's the review. When I put up there the slide, but Rabbi Levovitz said that we teach our children not with philosophy, but with experiences. The things they see and experience. How true is that? And to quote him, he said, "It is not within the faculties of man to be moved by intellect and wisdom, but rather from visualizations, actions, and experience." That's going back to the very beginning of where we began. That's what the night of the Seder is supposed to be. It's not about philosophy. It's about experience. It's about rituals that when we connect the thoughts, when we connect the ideas to the rituals, we have a very powerful experience that allows us to pass on the beautiful tradition that we are part of and be a link in that long change of our ancestors. To review quickly, and then I will open the floor to questions. I'm sorry if we're going a bit late. It's just now an hour. So let me just quickly review. We discussed 3 points. Basically, experience and action. We saw that the reality of the physical, the value of actions, and I have a slide up here for those who want to follow along. Just to review, an active practice. We discussed how and why making an active practice becomes a powerful experience. In terms of rituals, we discussed the importance of them being demands. We discussed how they awaken us from our slumber. And then we discussed the specific Pesach rituals, chametz, and I just put in the midot for you. Chametz, which has to do with the midah of arrogance, alacrity. The Passover sacrifice, which we saw that the word Pesach means not only Passover, but it also means compassion. And that was the unique relationship, the sacred relationship that we have with God. Matzah represents simplicity, humility, and true freedom. Maror, faith, and tradition, which is gratitude, sweetness, and joy. If you want to be a part of the tradition, that's what is necessary. You have to show gratitude. You have to appreciate where we've come from and that we're still here. All the blessings in your life, this is the time to appreciate them, and to do that with sweetness and joy, because that's the only way that we can pass on our traditions. And now I will take some questions. Okay. Okay, I have a comment here from Elisa. She missed some of the idea of the matzah, and the idea that we spoke about was the connection between the matzah being poor man's bread and at the same time representing freedom. And the idea that we mentioned is that the more simplicity you have in your life, the more free you are. And that when we cloud our lives or we bombard our lives with more things, that doesn't make us more free, but that it makes us more of a slave. We become slaves to the many things that we have. That's one idea. Simplicity relates to freedom. And the second idea is that when we talk about simplicity, we're also talking about serving not everything else in our lives, but serving God or spiritual practice. So those are the two ideas that we mentioned. So Rick says, we didn't really get a chance to fully appreciate how Rick is asking that please elaborate on the connection between Mora and faith. I'll say it this way, and there are many ways to go about it. If a person, if you take a plant, and the essence of a plant is that it grows, and you stop it from growing, what happens to the plant? It dies. And it not only does it die, but it dissolves. The same thing with an animal. An animal is alive, but if you kill the animal, it doesn't go down one level, it doesn't go down to being a plant, it totally disintegrates. The same thing is true with the Jewish nation. The Jewish nation suffers because when a Jew does not live up to his or her destiny, he or she does not just go down one level and become like the nations of the world. But the idea of this, not just philosophically understanding that God is the source of good and evil, but that our purpose in the world requires that we have that double-edged sword. Because if we live up to our purpose, we are the greatest nation. But when we don't live up to our purpose, and we don't have the proper faith in God, then we lose our essence. We lose our essential being, what we are, who and what we are. That's what Morah is. Morah reminds us that we have a purpose in the world, and we have a direction in the world. And when I say faith here, I don't mean just the midah of faith that a person trusts, but I mean the Jewish faith as a very, very broad, in a very, very broad sense. Any other questions here? Yeah, all that wine puts us in a state of slumber. That's true. We didn't discuss the wine, but I think that's much more self-evident. I think, drinking has a certain, there's nothing like drinking to put you in the right mood. And of course it has to be done with a little bit of restraint, but that allows us to feel not just the joy of life, but it also, in a sense, allows us to feel the grandeur of life when done properly, and again, within the proper context. All rituals have to be done within the proper context. They lose their meaning when they're taken out of context. Any other questions? Any other questions? I thank you all for participating, and I hope somewhat clear, and I know we covered a lot. Anybody who wants the slides could email me. My email is easy to find on the Mussar Institute website, and of course, you could email Jeff, and Jeff could pass it along if you don't have my email. But I'd be happy to send my slides to anybody who wants them, so you'll have the quotations. And I wish you all a very joyous and meaningful Passover. It's really just a pleasure, again, to be able to lock my door and spend an hour learning and studying with you, with all of you. And I guess it's become the custom over here to do a song. And I know Rick is here, or he was here, and I don't want to, I'm not going to. It's just one traditional song before I log out. I think I have to do this without my glasses. We'll do V'hisha Amda. V'hisha Amda, one of the first songs in the Passover Haggadah, which translates to mean that V'hisha Amda La'avoseinu V'lanu, that speaking about God, He was with us, our ancestors, and to us, Shelo Echad Bilvad Amar Aleinu L'Chalosenu. There wasn't just one nation that came to destroy us. Ella Shebekol Dor Vador. In every generation, Omdim Aleinu L'Chalosenu, they come to destroy us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Master of the world, Matzilenu Miyado, saves us. And I'll just, as we log off, and everybody can log off at their own leisure, we'll sing together, and please join me as we sing the traditional tune for V'hisha Amda. And it goes like this. V'hisha Amda, V'hisha Amda, La'avoseinu V'lanu. V'hisha Amda, V'hisha Amda, La'avoseinu V'lanu. Shelo Echad Bilvad Amar Aleinu L'Chaloseinu. Shelo Echad Bilvad Amar Aleinu L'Chaloseinu. Elo Shebechol Dor Vador. Amar Aleinu L'Chaloseinu. V'Hakadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miyavadam. V'Hakadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miyavadam. One more time. V'hisha Amda, V'hisha Amda, La'avoseinu V'lanu. V'hisha Amda, V'hisha Amda, La'avoseinu V'lanu. Shelo Echad Bilvad Amar Aleinu L'Chaloseinu. Shelo Echad Bilvad Amar Aleinu L'Chaloseinu. Elo Shebechol Dor Vador. Amar Aleinu L'Chaloseinu. V'Hakadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miyavadam. V'Hakadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miyavadam. I wish you all a very joyous and meaningful Passover Pesach.